The Gulf Coast of Mexico holds a secret that archaeologists are still trying to understand. Near the modern city of Veracruz, hidden beneath centuries of jungle growth, the Cempoala stone circles rise from earth that's been farmed, walked over, and largely ignored for generations. Most visitors to this region know about the Aztec temples, the Spanish conquest, the familiar narratives we've all heard before. But these circles, they predate all of that. We're looking at structures built somewhere between 1200 and 1519 AD, though recent excavations suggest the foundational work might reach back even further. The Totonac people, who controlled this region before the Aztecs arrived, left behind something remarkable here. Not pyramids, not palaces, stone circles arranged in patterns that seem to map something we haven't quite figured out yet. Each circle measures roughly 30 to 40 feet in diameter. The stones themselves aren't massive, nothing like Stonehenge, but their placement shows a precision that demands explanation. Stand in the center of one at dawn during the spring equinox, and the sun rises directly over a specific marker stone. Do the same during winter solstice, and a different stone frames the sunrise perfectly. The Totonacs never developed a written language we've been able to fully decode, so we're left reading their intentions through architecture alone. What we do know comes from Spanish chronicles, written decades after contact, and those accounts are problematic at best. The conquistadors weren't archaeologists. They were looking for gold, not understanding. But here's what makes Cempoala particularly intriguing. The circles aren't alone. Scattered throughout the complex are smaller stone arrangements, almost like satellites orbiting the main structures. Some align with the circles, others point toward geographic features miles away, specific mountains, river junctions, coastal landmarks. Local tradition, passed down through generations who've farmed this land, suggests these were ceremonial spaces, places where the community gathered during harvest times, where important decisions were made, where the living connected with ancestors. That makes sense on the surface, but it doesn't explain the astronomical precision. Modern surveys using ground-penetrating radar have revealed something unexpected beneath the visible circles. There's a network of stone channels, too regular to be natural, running between each formation. Some archaeologists think these carried water for rituals. Others believe they might have been acoustic channels, designed to carry sound in specific ways during ceremonies. Then there's the matter of the stones themselves. Geological analysis shows they didn't come from nearby. The nearest quarry matching their composition sits almost 12 miles to the west, across difficult terrain. Moving them would have required organization, planning, and a labor force working toward a shared goal we can only guess at. What's equally puzzling is what we haven't found. No evidence of permanent dwellings within the circle complex. No burial sites, no trash heaps or tool caches that would indicate people lived here day to day. Whatever happened at Cempoala's stone circles, it wasn't routine daily life. The Spanish virtually destroyed what remained of Totonac culture during their conquest of Mexico. Temples were dismantled, priests were killed or converted, and oral traditions were severed. By the time anyone thought to seriously document these circles, the people who built them had been gone for centuries. We're left with stones that still stand, still align with celestial events, still pose questions we're only beginning to ask properly. Climate studies of the region reveal that during the circle's construction period, the Gulf Coast experienced significant environmental changes. Rainfall patterns shifted, the coastline moved. What we see today isn't what the builders saw. That complicates interpretation even further. Some researchers propose that Cempoala was part of a larger network of similar sites stretching along the coast, most now lost to erosion, agriculture, and urban development. If that's true, we're looking at fragments of something much bigger, a systematic attempt to mark the land in ways that transcended individual settlements. The few Totonac descendants who still live in the region speak of these circles with a reverence that goes beyond tourism. They'll tell you stories passed down about the old ones, who could read the sky like we read books, who knew when rains would come, when to plant, when danger approached. The circles, they say, were tools for that reading. Modern astronomers confirm the circles tracked not only the sun, but specific pre-Columbian star patterns altered by Earth's axial precession. Cempoala remains silent, but it still asks what our ancestors knew and what we've forgotten. Deep in the Peruvian Andes, where the air thins and modern roads give way to footpaths, lies a place the Inca considered sacred long before they built their empire. Vilcabamba isn't Machu Picchu. It doesn't draw crowds or appear on travel agency brochures. The stone complex here sits at roughly 9,000 feet elevation, tucked into a valley that seems designed to keep secrets. Spanish conquistadors searched for this region obsessively in the 1500s, convinced it held the last refuge of Inca gold. They found ruins, just not the kind they were hoping for. The stones at Vilcabamba don't fit the architectural style we associate with the Inca. They're older, rougher in some ways, yet more ambitious in others. Massive blocks, some weighing upward of 70 tons, fitted together without mortar, in patterns that have survived earthquakes that leveled everything built afterward. Walk through the complex on a clear morning, and you'll notice something immediately. The stones aren't randomly placed. They form distinct clusters, each oriented toward different points on the horizon. One group faces the rising sun during June solstice. Another aligns perfectly with the Southern Cross constellation, as it appeared roughly 2,000 years ago. That dating creates problems for conventional timelines. The Inca Empire, as we know it, flourished between 1400 and 1533 AD. But radiocarbon dating of organic material found between the stone joints at Vilcabamba suggests construction phases reaching back to at least 800 AD. Some samples have tested even older, though those results remain controversial. Either the Inca inherited these structures from a predecessor culture, or our understanding of when advanced stonework began in the Andes needs serious revision. The Conquistador chronicles mention Vilcabamba repeatedly, but always in frustrating fragments. Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa, writing in 1572, described it as a place of the old ones before the Inca held power. Another Spanish account calls it a fortress not made by men of this age. Dramatic language, certainly, but based on what they were seeing. Engineering that didn't match anything in their European experience. The stone complex follows the natural contours of the landscape in ways that seem almost deliberate, as if the builders were working with the mountain rather than imposing structures upon it. Terraces step down the hillside in gradual increments, each level containing stone platforms that serve no obvious agricultural purpose. Too small for significant farming, too exposed for comfortable habitation. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 2019 revealed something unexpected beneath the visible structures. A network of chambers and passages extending into the mountainside itself. Some appear natural, enlarged and modified by human hands. Others seem entirely excavated from solid rock. What's down there remains largely unexplored. The Peruvian government has restricted access pending proper archaeological protocols. Local Quechua communities who live in the valley below maintain traditions about Vilcabamba that don't appear in any Spanish records. They speak of it as a listening place, where ancestors came to hear messages from the earth itself. One elder interviewed during a 2015 documentary expedition described rituals where community leaders would spend nights alone among the stones, waiting for guidance on important decisions. That might sound like folklore, but acoustic studies of the site have discovered something peculiar. The stone arrangements create unusual sound properties. Certain frequencies, particularly low-range tones around 30 to 40 Hz, resonate and amplify within the complex in ways that don't occur naturally. Whether this was intentional or accidental, we can't say for certain. But it wasn't random. The engineering challenges alone should give us pause. Moving 70-ton blocks up a mountain, at elevation, without wheels or draft animals. The Inca didn't have horses until the Spanish arrived, requires knowledge of leverage, friction, and materials that we're only now beginning to appreciate. Some archaeologists propose elaborate ramp systems. Others suggest the blocks were quarried closer than we think, though geological surveys haven't confirmed nearby sources. Then there's the matter of the cuts themselves. Several stones at Vilcabamba show evidence of precise shaping, using techniques that leave marks inconsistent with bronze or stone tools, which is what the culture supposedly had access to. The cuts are too clean, the angles too exact. Some researchers have proposed harder tool materials we haven't found yet. Others suggest methods involving heat or chemical weathering to soften stone before carving. Neither explanation fully satisfies the evidence. The Spanish abandoned their search, and the Inca knowledge keepers were gone, lost to disease and conquest. On the Isle of Lewis, off the northwestern coast of Scotland, a stone tower rises from landscape that hasn't changed much in 2,000 years. Dun Carloway isn't graceful. It's not meant to be. The Broch, that's what these structures are called, stands roughly 30 feet tall now, though it once reached higher. Double-walled, hollow in the center, built from stones that fit together with a tightness that still baffles engineers who study it. No mortar, no cement, just stone on stone, holding fast against North Atlantic storms that have eroded coastlines and toppled everything else built in the same era. The Picts constructed Dun Carloway sometime between 200 BC and 200 AD. At least, that's the time frame archaeologists generally agree on. But the Picts left no written records, so we're estimating based on artifacts found inside and comparisons with similar structures scattered across Scotland's northern reaches. More than 500 brochs dot the Scottish landscape. Dun Carloway is simply one of the best preserved. Stand outside it on a winter afternoon when the light comes in low across the moorland, and you'll understand why someone chose this spot. Visibility extends for miles in every direction. The Atlantic stretches to the west. Hills roll eastward toward the interior. Anyone approaching would be seen long before they arrived. That's led to the most common explanation. These were defensive structures, fortifications built during unstable times when raids from sea or land were constant threats. The design supports this interpretation to a degree. The walls are 12 feet thick at the base. The single entrance is narrow, easily defended. Internal galleries wind upward in a spiral, creating multiple levels where defenders could position themselves. But here's what doesn't fit the fortress theory. No evidence of violence. No scorch marks from fires set during sieges. No arrowheads, No weapon caches, no skeletal remains showing trauma. Excavations inside Dun Carloway have uncovered pottery, tools, remnants of daily life. Just not the signs of conflict you'd expect from a structure supposedly built for war. The architecture itself poses questions that defensive purposes don't adequately answer. The interior space is relatively small, maybe 30 feet in diameter. You could house a family, perhaps two, but not a garrison. The galleries that wind through the walls are ingeniously constructed, true, but they're also acoustic chambers. Sound carries through them in peculiar ways. Speak at ground level in a normal voice, and someone 3 levels up hears you clearly, as if you were standing beside them. Was that intentional, or just a happy accident of double-wall construction? Archaeological evidence suggests people lived in Dun Carloway for centuries, possibly as late as the 1600s. Layers of occupation debris tell a story of continuous habitation, abandonment, reoccupation. The structure adapted to different needs across different eras, but its original purpose, what the Pictish builders had in mind, remains frustratingly unclear. Local tradition offers another perspective, though one that's harder to quantify. Older residents of Lewis, particularly those who speak Gaelic and maintain connections to pre-Christian island customs, describe brochs as threshold places, not quite of the world, not quite separate from it, places where the boundary between earthly and spiritual grew thin. That sounds mystical until you consider the alignments. Dun Carloway's entrance faces almost exactly southeast. During the winter solstice, sunrise light penetrates directly into the interior, illuminating the back wall for approximately 15 minutes before the angle shifts. The same thing happens, reversed, during summer solstice at sunset through a gap in the upper gallery. Coincidence? Perhaps. But too many brochs share similar orientations for it to be entirely accidental. The stones themselves came from nearby outcrops, which makes sense given their weight and the difficulty of transport across rough terrain. But the selection wasn't random. Geological analysis shows the builders chose specific types of rock: harder stones for corners and stress points, slightly softer material for fill. They understood load distribution, compression, how weight travels through stacked stone. Modern attempts to replicate broch construction using period-appropriate tools have largely failed. The tolerances are too tight, the engineering too sophisticated. It's possible to stack stones into tower-like shapes, certainly, but not with the stability and longevity these structures demonstrate. Climate records show colder temperatures, shorter growing seasons, and scarce resources during the broch era. Yet communities invested years of labor to build hundreds of these towers across islands and coasts. Why? What threat or need justified that expense? In the humid lowlands of Veracruz, Mexico, a city rises from the jungle that shouldn't exist according to what we thought we knew about pre-Columbian architecture. El Tajín covers roughly a square mile of cleared forest, though ground-penetrating surveys suggest the ancient city extends far beyond what's been excavated. At its center stands the Pyramid of the Niches, a structure so geometrically precise, so mathematically deliberate, that it challenges assumptions about what cultures without written mathematical systems could achieve. The pyramid isn't massive by Mesoamerican standards. It rises only about 60 feet high. But count the niches, the square recesses built into each of its 6 levels, and you get exactly 365, one for each day of the solar year. That's not approximate, that's exact. The Totonac people, likely the same culture responsible for the Cempoala circles we discussed earlier, built El Tajín between 600 and 900 AD. At least, those are the dates that current excavations support. The city thrived during a period when the classic Maya civilization was collapsing to the south. While other Mesoamerican centers were being abandoned, El Tajín was expanding. What makes this site particularly significant isn't just one pyramid. It's the entire complex. 17 ball courts have been identified so far, more than any other Mesoamerican city. These weren't recreational facilities. The Mesoamerican ball game held profound ritual significance. Life and death stakes, quite literally, based on carved panels showing players being sacrificed after matches. But here's where El Tajín diverges from other sites: the architectural integration of seemingly incompatible elements. Pyramids aligned to solar events. Ball courts oriented to stellar risings. Buildings positioned to create sightlines that connect astronomical phenomena with earthly ceremonies. The whole city functions as a kind of three-dimensional calendar, marking time through stone and shadow. The niches on the pyramid create another effect that wasn't understood until recently. As the sun moves across the sky, shadows fill and empty from the recesses in a wave pattern that moves around the structure. Stand at the right position during equinox, and you can watch the shadow wave complete a full circuit in hours, giving ancient observers a visual representation of solar movement they could track and predict. Excavations beneath the visible structures have revealed earlier construction phases, some showing significantly different architectural styles. Foundation layers contain pottery and tools that predate the Totonac period, suggesting El Tajín was built atop something older, perhaps incorporating knowledge from predecessor cultures we know even less about. The ball courts themselves present engineering challenges that archaeologists are still working to fully understand. The playing surfaces are sloped at precise angles, not level as you might expect. The acoustics within the courts are remarkable. Clap your hands at one end, and someone at the opposite end, roughly 150 feet away, hears a clear echo that sounds like a bird's chirp. Natural phenomenon? Or deliberate acoustic engineering built into the court's dimensions and materials? Spanish conquistadors never saw El Tajín in its glory. By the time Europeans arrived in the region, the city had been abandoned for centuries. The jungle had reclaimed it. Local indigenous people knew it was there, certainly, but they didn't speak of it much to outsiders. When archaeologists finally began serious excavations in the early 1900s, they found a city largely intact beneath the vegetation, unusual for sites that typically get scavenged for building materials over centuries. Recent LiDAR surveys, remote sensing technology that can map ground features through dense jungle canopy, have revealed that El Tajín was part of a much larger network of settlements connected by raised stone causeways. These roads, some stretching over 20 miles, linked El Tajín to other ceremonial centers in a pattern that suggests coordinated activity across the entire region. The question that bothers researchers is this: how did a culture without draft animals, without wheeled vehicles, without metal tools beyond basic copper implements, create such architectural sophistication? The standard answer involves large labor forces and long construction periods. That explains the muscle, but not the knowledge. The mathematical precision alone indicates advanced understanding. The 365 niches aren't just decorative, they're a statement. We understand the solar year. We can count it. We can build it into permanent stone. That requires observation over generations, record-keeping systems we haven't found evidence for, and transmission of knowledge across time in ways that survived despite the absence of written texts. In northern Sudan, where the Nile bends through desert that has known human settlement longer than almost anywhere else on Earth, mud brick structures rise from sand that predates the Egyptian pyramids. Kerma doesn't get the attention that Egypt commands. It sits upstream, south of the traditional pharaonic heartland, in territory that ancient Egyptians referred to as Kush. The Deffufa, that's what the locals call the massive mud brick structures here, stand as monuments to a civilization that thrived when Egypt was still finding its footing. The Western Deffufa, the larger of the two main structures, measures roughly 160 feet long and 80 feet wide at its base. It rises 50 feet into air that shimmers with heat most of the year, built entirely from mud brick. No stone, no mortar, just Nile clay mixed with straw, shaped into blocks, dried under the African sun, then stacked into a mass that has survived nearly 4,000 years. That's the part that doesn't make sense to modern engineers. Mud brick shouldn't last that long, not in this climate, with temperature swings from scorching days to cold desert nights, not with the occasional violent rainstorm that pounds the region. The Deffufa should have eroded into shapeless mounds centuries ago, but it hasn't. Archaeological excavations beginning in the 1970s revealed why. The builders used graduated brick sizes throughout the structure. Larger bricks at the base, progressively smaller as the structure rises. The clay composition varies by level as well. Different ratios of sand to silt, different binding materials mixed in. The whole thing functions as an integrated system designed to handle stress, expansion, contraction. Kerma flourished between 2500 and 1500 BC. During that millennium, it served as the capital of the Kingdom of Kush, a power that traded with Egypt, fought with Egypt, and occasionally conquered parts of Egypt. The relationship between these two Nile civilizations was complex, sometimes cooperative, often hostile, always interconnected. The eastern Deffufa, smaller than its western counterpart, sits about a mile away, within what was clearly a separate ceremonial precinct. This structure shows different architectural features: interior chambers, narrow passageways, what appear to be alteration phases, suggesting it was modified multiple times over centuries of use. What were these buildings for? The honest answer is we're not entirely sure. No inscriptions explain their purpose. The Kerma culture left no extensive written records that we've deciphered. We're left interpreting based on archaeological context and comparison with other ancient structures. The most accepted theory suggests they were temples, though temples to what deity or serving what specific rituals remains unclear. Burial sites surrounding both Defufas have yielded thousands of graves, some containing individuals buried with significant wealth. Gold, ivory, elaborate pottery. The positioning of these graves in relation to the structures suggests the Defufas held religious significance, at minimum. But here's what complicates that interpretation: astronomical alignments that seem too precise to ignore. The Western Deffufa's main axis runs almost exactly east-west. During equinoxes, sunrise and sunset align directly with the structure's longest walls. Whether this was intentional or coincidental, we can't say definitively, but the builders certainly had the sophistication to plan such alignments if they chose to. Recent excavations have uncovered something unexpected. Beneath the visible structures lie earlier construction phases. The Defufas weren't built in single campaigns. They were raised, added to, modified over centuries. Some foundation layers contain pottery styles that predate the Kingdom of Kush itself, suggesting the site held significance even before Kerma became a political capital. The scale of labor required to build these structures was enormous. Estimates suggest the Western Deffufa alone required several million mud bricks. Manufacturing that many bricks, transporting them, stacking them under controlled conditions to prevent collapse during construction. That's a multi-generational project, requiring organization, planning, and a stable society capable of sustaining such efforts. Climate studies show that during Kerma's peak, the Sahara was drying, but still a transitional savanna with seasonal rain and vegetation. The Nile flooded differently, creating a landscape less harsh than today. This environment supplied clay and straw, allowing a mud brick civilization to thrive using materials renewed by the river. The kingdom of Kush fell to Egyptian expansion around 1500 BC, and Kerma was abandoned. Though pharaohs claimed victory over barbarians, archaeology tells another story. This was a sophisticated culture, building mud brick monuments that outlasted stone elsewhere. In the hills of northern Morocco, about 11 miles from the coastal town of Asila, stands a stone circle that most of the world has never heard of. Mzora doesn't appear in standard archaeology textbooks. It doesn't draw tourist crowds. The 167 standing stones, arranged in an ellipse measuring roughly 180 feet across, site on private farmland, surrounded by olive groves and wheat fields that have been cultivated for generations. Local farmers work around the stones, have done so for as long as anyone can remember, treating them as permanent features of the landscape, like hills or streams. The stones themselves aren't uniform. Some reach 10 feet tall, others barely clear 5 feet. They're arranged in a pattern that's clearly deliberate, but whose purpose remains debated. At the center of the ellipse stands a single large stone, a marker of some kind, though what it marked or why has been lost to time. Dating Mzora has proved difficult. No organic material has been found in direct association with the stones that would allow radiocarbon dating. The stones themselves are local limestone, weathered by centuries of North African sun and wind. Based on weathering patterns and comparison with other megalithic sites, estimates place construction somewhere between 3000 and 1500 BC. But that's a wide window that doesn't tell us much. What we do know comes from measurements and alignments. The ellipse's major axis runs almost perfectly north-south. The entrance, if that's what it is, faces west toward the Atlantic Ocean, roughly 15 miles distant. During spring and autumn equinoxes, the sun sets directly in line with this western opening, framing the setting sun between two larger stones that flank the entrance. That alignment alone wouldn't prove intentionality, but there's more. The ellipse's proportions follow a mathematical ratio that appears repeatedly in ancient structures worldwide, roughly 3:2, the same ratio found in the golden section that architects have used for millennia to create aesthetically pleasing proportions. Local Berber tradition holds that Mzora marks the burial site of Antaeus, the mythological giant from Greek legend whom Hercules defeated. That's almost certainly mythologized history rather than literal fact, but the persistence of the story suggests the site held significance long before Islam arrived in North Africa, long before the Romans controlled these coastal regions. Roman writers mentioned a massive circular monument somewhere in Mauritania, the ancient name for this region, but their descriptions are vague, geographic references unclear. Whether they were describing Mzora or some other site lost to time, we can't say with certainty. Excavations in the 1930s, limited and poorly documented by modern standards, uncovered fragments of pottery and tools within the circle that suggested human activity spanning millennia. Different cultural layers, different time periods, all using this same space for purposes we can only infer. The number of stones, 167, has generated speculation about numerological or astronomical significance. Some researchers have proposed lunar calendars. Others suggest the count relates to star positions visible in the ancient night sky. None of these theories have been proven conclusively, but the specific number seems too large to be purely symbolic and too precise to be random. What makes Mzora particularly intriguing in our larger investigation is its isolation. The nearest comparable stone circles sit across the Mediterranean in southern Spain and Portugal, or much farther east in the Middle East. This region of Morocco doesn't have a tradition of megalithic construction. Mzora stands alone, an anomaly in North African archaeology. Yet the construction techniques, stones selected for size and shape, positioned upright in holes dug into bedrock, secured with smaller stones wedged around the bases. Match methods used in European megalithic sites, built around the same period. Either these techniques developed independently in different regions, or there was contact between cultures we've assumed had no meaningful interaction. The farmland surrounding Mzora has yielded artifacts spanning Phoenician, Roman, and Islamic periods, evidence of continuous human presence in the area. But none of those cultures claimed credit for the circle. Each seemed to inherit it from whoever came before, treating it as something ancient even in their time. Preservation has been haphazard. Several stones have fallen over the centuries. A few were removed, presumably for building materials, before local authorities designated the site protected in the mid-1900s. What we see now is incomplete, a fragment of whatever Mzora originally was. The olive trees are young, the wheat is seasonal, but the stones have stood for millennia, silent witnesses to lost empires and forgotten meanings. In the desert of northern Saudi Arabia, where summer temperatures regularly exceed 115 degrees Fahrenheit, 50 stone pillars stand in formations that suggest purpose but reveal no clear meaning. Al-Rajajil, the name translates roughly to the men in Arabic, sits near the town of Sakaka in Al-Jaf province. Local Bedouin tribes have known about these stones for generations, weaving them into folklore about giants turned to stone or ancient warriors frozen in time. But serious archaeological attention didn't arrive until the 1970s, and even then, study has been sporadic at best. The pillars themselves range from 3 to 10 feet tall, carved from local sandstone into roughly cylindrical shapes. They're not natural formations. The shaping is too deliberate, the groupings too regular. They're arranged in clusters, most containing between 3 and 7 stones, positioned in patterns that might be circles, might be alignments, or might be something else entirely, depending on how you interpret the fallen stones, mixed among those still standing. Dating has placed construction somewhere between 4000 and 2500 BC, making Al-Rajajil contemporary with some of the earliest Egyptian dynasties. But this region wasn't Egypt. There were no pharaohs here, no centralized kingdoms that we know of. The people who built these stone formations were likely pastoral nomads, moving through the landscape with herds, following water and seasonal vegetation. That raises an immediate question. Why would nomadic people invest the labor required to quarry, shape, and erect permanent stone monuments? Nomads travel light by necessity. They don't typically build things meant to last millennia. Yet here, these pillars stand, defying that assumption. The stones showed tool marks consistent with pecking and grinding, techniques where harder stones are used to slowly abrade softer stone into desired shapes. It's labor-intensive work. Each pillar would have required days, possibly weeks, of focused effort. Multiply that across 50 pillars, and you're looking at a significant community investment. But for what purpose? The most common interpretation suggests astronomical markers. Several of the pillar groups align with solar and stellar events visible in the ancient sky. One cluster marks the winter solstice sunrise with reasonable precision. Another appears oriented toward the rising point of Sirius, though precession of the equinoxes has shifted star positions since then, making ancient alignments harder to confirm with absolute certainty. Some researchers have proposed the site served as a kind of territorial marker, a way for groups moving through the region to identify meeting places or boundaries. In a landscape as featureless as the northern Arabian desert, permanent stone markers would have provided navigation reference points visible from considerable distances. Others suggest religious significance, though evidence for specific rituals remains thin. No burials have been found directly associated with the pillars. No offerings, no ceremonial objects. Nothing that clearly indicates worship or religious practice. If Al-Rajajil was a temple of some kind, it was unlike temples elsewhere in the ancient world. Recent excavations around the site's periphery have uncovered fragments of pottery and stone tools that indicate human presence over millennia. Different styles, different periods, suggesting people returned to this location repeatedly across vast stretches of time. That pattern of reuse implies the site held enduring significance, even as the cultures inhabiting the region changed. Climate reconstruction for the period shows that northern Arabia wasn't quite the harsh desert it is today. Rainfall was higher. Seasonal lakes formed in low-lying areas. Vegetation supported larger animal populations, making the region more hospitable to human habitation. The people who built Al-Rajajil lived in an environment more forgiving than the one that surrounds these stones now. What's particularly striking about Al-Rajajil is its position in a larger pattern. Throughout the Arabian Peninsula, smaller groupings of standing stones have been documented. Nothing as concentrated as this site, but enough to suggest a broader tradition of stone monument construction in ancient Arabia that hasn't received the scholarly attention it deserves. The pillars themselves are deteriorating. Sandstone doesn't weather as well as harder stones like granite. Wind erosion, temperature fluctuations, and occasional flash floods, when rare rains come, have taken their toll. Some pillars show significant degradation compared to photographs taken just 50 years ago. Without intervention, Al-Rajajil may not survive another few centuries. Saudi authorities have begun efforts to protect the site, restricting vehicle access and installing monitoring equipment to track weathering rates. But preservation in this climate is challenging. In the highlands of northern Ethiopia, at an elevation of roughly 7,000 feet, stands a stone temple that predates the Christian kingdom of Aksum by centuries. Yeha doesn't fit neatly into the narratives we tell about ancient Africa. The great temple here, with its precisely fitted stone walls still standing 40 feet high in places, represents architectural sophistication that challenges assumptions about when and where advanced building techniques developed on the continent. The structure dates to approximately 700 BC, placing it firmly in the pre-Aksumite period. This was ancient South Arabian influence, reaching across the Red Sea into the Ethiopian highlands, bringing with it architectural traditions, religious practices, and stoneworking knowledge that would fundamentally shape the region's development. The temple's walls are remarkable for their construction. Large limestone blocks, some weighing several tons, fitted together without mortar in a style that echoes techniques used in Yemen across the water. But these aren't crude imitations of foreign architecture. The builders adapted those techniques to local materials and conditions, creating something that belongs specifically to this highland environment. Walk around the perimeter, and you'll notice the precision. The corners meet at exact right angles. The courses of stone remain level across spans of 30 feet or more. The blocks themselves show minimal gaps between them, tight enough that a knife blade won't fit in most joints. That level of accuracy requires sophisticated surveying tools and mathematical understanding of angles and proportions. The temple originally stood as part of a larger complex. Excavations have revealed foundation walls of surrounding structures, evidence of courtyards, what appear to be ceremonial pools or cisterns. Yeha wasn't just a temple, it was a religious center serving a wider community, drawing pilgrims or worshippers from the surrounding region. The deity worshipped here was likely Al-Maka, the moon god of the Sabaean culture centered in Yemen. Inscriptions found at the site, written in the ancient South Arabian script, reference this deity and describe offerings made by local rulers. These texts provide rare written evidence of the culture that built Yeha, though frustratingly, they tell us more about who made offerings than about the structure itself or how it was built. What puzzles archaeologists is the complete absence of construction debris around the site. When ancient peoples built large stone structures, they left behind evidence of the work: broken tools, discarded stone chips, construction ramps, quarry sites nearby. Yeha shows almost none of this. Either the site was meticulously cleaned after construction, which seems unlikely, or the building techniques employed methods that didn't generate the waste we'd expect. The stones themselves came from quarries located several miles away, according to geological analysis. Moving multi-ton blocks across that distance, then up to this elevated site, would have required organization and labor resources, indicating a stable, structured society capable of sustaining such projects over years or decades. The interior of the temple has been modified over subsequent centuries. Christian monks occupied Yeha, starting around the 6th century AD, converting the ancient temple into a church. They built walls inside the original structure, added windows, installed altars. These modifications make it difficult to determine exactly what the temple's interior configuration looked like originally. But the exterior walls remain largely as they were built 27 centuries ago. The limestone has weathered, certainly. Lichens grow in patches on the northern faces where moisture collects. But the structural integrity hasn't failed. No major collapses, no significant shifting of the massive blocks. Recent studies using ground-penetrating radar have suggested there may be chambers or passages beneath the temple that haven't been excavated. Ethiopian authorities have been cautious about invasive archaeology at Yeha, particularly given its continued use as a religious site by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. The monastery built within and around the ancient temple remains active, monks still conducting services in spaces that have seen worship in various forms for nearly 3,000 years. The connection between Yeha and the later Aksumite kingdom remains a subject of scholarly debate. Aksum, which rose to prominence starting around the 1st century AD, built its own impressive stone architecture, including massive carved obelisks and palace complexes. Did Aksumite builders learn from Yeha, Or were both cultures drawing on the same South Arabian architectural traditions independently? What's clear is that Yeha demonstrates that advanced stone architecture in highland Ethiopia has roots reaching back far earlier than the better-known Aksumite period. Beneath the Temple of Seti, the first at Abydos in southern Egypt, lies a structure that doesn't belong to the same architectural tradition as the temple built above it. The Osireion, named for its supposed association with Osiris, god of the underworld, sits roughly 50 feet below ground level, carved from bedrock and constructed from limestone and granite blocks that dwarf anything in the temple overhead. Some of these blocks weigh upward of 100 tons. They're fitted together with a precision that's difficult to explain, using the tools and techniques we assume the ancient Egyptians possessed. The conventional timeline places the Osireion's construction during Seti I's reign, roughly 1300 BC. After all, it sits directly behind his temple. The association seems obvious, but archaeological evidence tells a more complicated story. The architectural style is completely different from anything else built during the 19th dynasty. The Osireion uses massive megalithic blocks with minimal decoration. Stark, geometric, focused on weight and mass, rather than the elaborate carvings and paintings that characterize New Kingdom Egyptian architecture. It resembles nothing else from Seti's period. Instead, it looks remarkably similar to structures from the Old Kingdom, particularly the valley temples associated with the Giza pyramids, built roughly 1,000 years earlier. Same construction techniques, same use of enormous stones, same emphasis on geometric precision over decorative elements. That similarity has led some researchers to propose that the Osireion is far older than the temple above it, that Seti I's builders discovered an ancient structure already there and incorporated it into their temple complex, perhaps interpreting it as a sacred site worth preserving. The layout supports this interpretation. The Osireion consists of a central hall, surrounded by a moat-like channel, with massive pillars supporting enormous lintels overhead. The whole thing would have been covered originally, creating a dark, enclosed space with water flowing around the central platform. Water is key to understanding this structure's purpose, or at least its symbolic meaning. The ancient Egyptians associated the primordial mound, the first land that emerged from the waters of chaos at creation, with Osiris and resurrection. The Osireion's design, with its central island surrounded by water, clearly references that mythology. But here's where things get stranger. The water wasn't decorative. The moat channels connected to the Nile's groundwater table. When the river flooded annually, water would rise through the channels, actually flooding the structure to depths of several feet. The central platform would become an island, just as mythology described the primordial mound. That's sophisticated hydraulic engineering. The channels had to be precisely calculated to allow water in and out without eroding the structure or flooding uncontrollably. The platform height had to be exact, tall enough to remain above the water during a flooding, but not so tall that the symbolic effect was lost. Excavations in the early 1900s, when the Osireion was first properly documented, found that silt deposits inside the structure reached depths suggesting flooding continued for centuries. This wasn't a one-time effect. This was a structure designed to flood and drain repeatedly, year after year, as part of its intended function. The granite used in construction came from Aswan, roughly 200 miles south. Moving 100-ton blocks that distance, then lowering them into a pit 50 feet deep with the precision required for the tight joints we see, represents an engineering challenge that modern contractors would struggle with using current equipment. Standard explanations involve ramps, levers, and massive labor forces. Those methods can move stone, certainly, but they don't adequately explain the precision. The granite blocks in the Osireion fit together with gaps measuring fractions of an inch, across joints spanning 20 feet. That's not the result of brute force. That's careful planning and execution, requiring accurate measurement and mathematical understanding. Tool marks on the granite show evidence of methods that don't match what we know about bronze or copper tools available in ancient Egypt. Some cuts appear too clean, too straight, suggesting either harder tools we haven't found evidence for, or techniques involving abrasives and time that we haven't fully reconstructed. The ceiling blocks, enormous lintels weighing dozens of tons each, pose their own questions. How do you position those precisely atop pillars while working 50 feet below ground level in a confined space? The logistics alone seem nearly impossible. Yet there they sit, still bearing their tremendous weight after 3,000 years minimum. The Osireion hides its secrets in plain sight, beneath a familiar temple, quietly challenging accepted timelines. In the foothills of central Greece, near the city of Volos, lies evidence of Europe's earliest known organized settlement, a community that thrived when most of the continent was still inhabited by scattered hunter-gatherer groups. Sesklo dates to approximately 7,000 BC. That's 9,000 years ago. To put that in perspective, this settlement was already ancient when the first pyramids were being planned in Egypt. The people living here were farming, raising livestock, and building permanent stone structures, while much of Europe was still living in temporary shelters. The settlement covers roughly 50 acres, though the core residential area is smaller, perhaps 50 acres of concentrated building. What makes Sesklo significant isn't just its age, it's the level of organization visible in the ruins. This wasn't a random clustering of huts. The buildings follow planned layouts. Streets run in deliberate patterns. There's evidence of communal structures separate from residential spaces. The houses themselves were rectangular, built from stone foundations supporting mud brick walls. Roofs were likely thatch or wood, which haven't survived, but post holes and wall configurations suggest pitched roofs designed to shed the region's winter rains. Some structures had 2 stories, with stone staircases still visible in the archaeological record. What's remarkable is the consistency. The buildings show similar construction techniques, similar dimensions, similar layouts across the settlement. That implies shared knowledge, shared standards, some form of community planning that went beyond individual families, building whatever suited their immediate needs. The site's centerpiece is what archaeologists call the Acropolis, a raised area with larger structures built on stone platforms. One building in particular stands out, roughly 30 feet long, divided into multiple rooms, with foundations indicating substantial walls capable of supporting significant weight. This was likely a communal building, perhaps for gatherings, storage, or religious ceremonies. Excavations have revealed sophisticated pottery throughout the settlement. Not crude vessels, but well-formed pieces with decorative patterns showing artistic sensibility and technical skill. The clay was tempered, fired at controlled temperatures in kilns that would have required knowledge of combustion and heat management. These people understood materials science in practical, applied ways. Agricultural evidence shows they were growing emmer wheat and barley, along with lentils and peas. They kept sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs. This wasn't subsistence farming. The variety and quantities suggest surplus production, food security beyond immediate needs. That surplus is what allows communities to develop specialized skills, pottery, building, tool-making, because not everyone needs to spend all their time producing food. Tool assemblages from Sesklo show the transition from stone to early metallurgy. While most tools were still stone, obsidian from the island of Melos, flint from local sources, a few copper objects have been found in later layers, dating to around 5,500 BC. These early metal items weren't practical tools yet. They were ornamental, status objects, suggesting developing social hierarchies and trade networks sophisticated enough to move materials between regions. The obsidian is particularly telling. Melos sits roughly 150 miles southeast across open water. Getting obsidian from there to Sesklo required maritime trade networks, boats, navigation knowledge, established exchange relationships between distant communities. This wasn't isolated village life. These people were connected to broader regional systems. Climate studies of the period show favorable conditions for agriculture in this part of Greece. Temperatures were stable, rainfall adequate, growing seasons long enough to support the crops they were cultivating. The environment was conducive to settled life in ways that encouraged the kind of long-term investment we see in Sesklo's architecture. But here's what's puzzling. The settlement was abandoned around 5,500 BC, after flourishing for roughly 1,500 years. There's no clear evidence of destruction, no signs of warfare or catastrophic events. The people simply left. Later occupations occurred on the site, but they were different cultures with different building traditions. The original Sesklo culture disappeared. Where did they go? Did they migrate to other regions, carrying their agricultural knowledge and building techniques with them? Or did the community disperse, absorbed into other groups? The archaeological record doesn't provide clear answers. The ruins at Sesklo sit quietly, with stone foundations outlining buildings and streets visible as slight depressions. Excavation trenches cut through layers of human occupation, revealing walls, floors, and the material remains of daily life from 9 millennia ago. On a small island in the Gulf of Morbihan, off the coast of Brittany, France, sits a stone monument that represents one of the finest examples of Neolithic art in all of Europe. Gavrinis is a burial cairn, a massive mound of stone covering a passage grave, constructed around 3,500 BC. That places it in the same time frame as the early phases of Stonehenge, though the two monuments couldn't be more different in style and execution. The cairn itself rises roughly 20 feet above the island's highest point, built from an estimated 10,000 to 14,000 tons of stone. Local granite, quarried from outcrops visible on the Breton coast, transported to this island by methods we can only partially reconstruct. The exterior would have been smooth once, carefully stacked to create a dome-like profile. Erosion and stone robbing over millennia have left it rougher, but the basic form remains intact. The real significance lies inside. A passage roughly 40 feet long leads from the cairn's southern edge to a central chamber. The passage is lined with 29 stone slabs, each standing upright, each covered almost entirely with carved designs. These aren't random decorations. The carvings show deliberate patterns, spirals, concentric arcs, U-shapes, serpentine lines, axes, geometric forms that repeat with variations across multiple stones. The density of carving is extraordinary. Nearly every available surface on the passage stones bears decoration. Someone invested hundreds, possibly thousands of hours, pecking these designs into hard granite using stone tools. The central chamber, roughly 8 feet square, sits beneath a massive capstone weighing an estimated 17 tons. This single stone had to be positioned precisely atop the chamber walls, at the center of the cairn, before the entire structure was covered with thousands of tons of additional stone. The engineering required for that placement alone represents sophisticated understanding of forces, balance, and structural stability. What do the carvings mean? That's been debated since the cairn was first properly studied in the 1830s. Some patterns resemble natural forms, waves perhaps, or representations of water. The site's position on an island surrounded by tidal waters that change dramatically twice daily lends support to water-related interpretations. Other designs suggest astronomical significance. Certain arc patterns, when measured carefully, correspond to lunar cycles visible in the Neolithic sky. The spirals might represent solar movement, the turning of seasons, or cosmological concepts about birth, death, and renewal that burial monuments naturally evoke. But here's what complicates simple interpretations. Several of the stones in Gavrinis were reused from earlier structures. They were already carved when they were incorporated into this cairn. That means some of the designs we see weren't created for this specific monument. They belonged to something else first, something older, something that was dismantled to build what we see now. One stone in particular, stone C7 in archaeological notation, shows a pattern that matches almost exactly with designs on standing stones at other Breton sites, some located miles away. Either the same carvers worked across multiple sites, or there was a shared symbolic language being expressed in stone across the region. Excavations inside the chamber found evidence of cremated human remains, though not many. This massive structure, requiring enormous communal effort to construct, apparently served as a tomb for only a select few individuals. That suggests social stratification. Chiefs, priests, individuals of high status receiving burial rites unavailable to common people. The passage alignment is significant. It opens to the southeast, positioned so that during winter solstice, the rising sun's light penetrates deep into the passage, illuminating the chamber briefly. That solar connection appears intentional, linking death, burial, and the seasonal renewal promised by the sun's return from its southernmost point. Recent analysis using photogrammetry, detailed three-dimensional mapping of the carvings, has revealed that some designs were carved in multiple phases. Earlier, shallower carvings were later enhanced or modified with deeper pecking. The monument wasn't decorated all at once. It was worked over time, perhaps across generations, with each phase adding or altering what came before. The tiny island of Gavrinis, barely 10 acres, would have been dominated by its massive cairn, visible to anyone approaching by boat. The Gulf of Morbihan holds hundreds of megalithic monuments from a 1,000-year Neolithic period, where communities express themselves through stone. Gavrinis stands out, not largest or oldest, but the most artistically sophisticated, with carvings spiraling across passage stones, still posing questions about their meaning after 5,000 years. From the Gulf Coast of Mexico to the highlands of Georgia, from Scottish islands to Arabian deserts, we've traced a pattern that conventional archaeology struggles to explain. Different continents, different cultures, different time periods, yet the same techniques appear repeatedly, astronomical alignments that track celestial events with precision, massive stones fitted without mortar, acoustic properties that seem too deliberate to be accidental, geometric proportions that mirror mathematical constants. Were these parallel developments, human minds, independently reaching similar solutions to universal questions? Or was there contact, knowledge exchange across distances we've assumed were unbridgeable? The stones can't tell us. They can only stand as they have for millennia, marking knowledge that survived in architecture long after the builders themselves were forgotten. What connected these ancient engineers remains one of archaeology's most compelling mysteries. And perhaps that's exactly what they intended. Questions carved in stone, waiting for us to finally ask the right ones. If this exploration into our forgotten past intrigued you, subscribe to support more investigations into the mysteries our ancestors left behind. There are more stories waiting in stone.